So welcome again to Ethnography of Iran, Past and Present. My name is Rose Wellman, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Sharmin and Bijan Mostafa Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. This conference's aim is to examine the impact of ethnographic research on our understanding of Iran, the Middle East, and anthropology as a discipline. The conference convenes renowned scholars of Iran who conducted research before the 1979 revolution, together with more junior scholars who have conducted fieldwork in the post-revolutionary Islamic Republic. Our event today is sponsored by the Sharmin and Bijan Mostafa Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, and the Anthropology Department here at Princeton. I am now delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor William O. Beeman, an internationally known expert on the Middle East and the Islamic world, particularly Iran. Professor Beeman hails from the Anthropology Department at the University of Minnesota. He has published several key texts, including Language, Status, and Power in Iran, and The Great Satan versus the Mad Mullahs, How the United States and Iran Demonize Each Other. Please give Professor Beeman a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Rose. And so first we start with the ta'aruf, which is of course not ta'aruf, right? Thank you for the really great honor that you've bestowed on me in addressing this august body of superb researchers. Any one of you could be giving this keynote address, I can tell you. All of you have spent many years and fantastic energy in dedicated work on the ethnography of Iran, a nation and people whom we all deeply love. I'm humbled by the task of saying anything that would do this audience justice, and I pray that you'll forgive me for anything I might say that would fail to do honor of all of your work. I want to apologize to everyone in advance, however, because I'm going to be mentioning very few names of living anthropologists in my talk. This is for two reasons. First, I can't mention one group of persons without slighting others whose work is excellent and meritorious. Second, I believe that anthropology, like all science, is a collective enterprise. We all contribute to the common store of advancement in knowledge and depend on each other for information and also for inspiration. But as others have, I'd like to start with my own autobiography. I firmly believe, actually, that every one of us has a set of existential questions that we wish to solve, sometimes without even being aware of them. The set of questions is what sustains us throughout our career, because actually they never have an answer. If we're lucky, we find opportunities to work with these questions, and we may even find some answers. For me, the driving questions had to do with finding ways of understanding how communication structures could alter the course of human life. But finding a way to pursue these questions was not clear. And here I have to give a little bit of credit to my fate. My own career is filled with serendipity. I've come to believe in qismat, that the universe oftentimes presents one with directions, and when one has the sensitivity to follow, it can lead one's life in productive directions, and such is my case. I began my anthropological work in Iran when I was an undergraduate student and had an opportunity to go to the Persian Gulf with an oil drilling company. I was already intrigued by anthropology and linguistics, but to that point I was interested in American Indian culture. With one fell swoop, that serendipitous trip to Iran, arising from a chance encounter with a family friend in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I grew up, changed my entire life. I so loved my experience in the Persian Gulf with 120-degree weather and nearly 100% humidity that I thought that the universe was telling me something. I worked frantically to absorb everything I could about the island community where I was located and wrote a long undergraduate thesis about my experiences, my first primitive ethnography. I changed my interest to focus in Iran and the Middle East, and this was the beginning of my professional career, and this was in 1968. In my island study, the abstract ethnographic studies I had read in my classes suddenly came alive. I was living with people in an environment very different from any I had ever encountered before, but they welcomed me, they became my friends. I was enmeshed in their lives in ways that I could never have imagined before going. My world on the Persian Gulf island was very small, but it quickly expanded. I luckily fell in with some local merchants, and I traveled throughout the Gulf with them by boat to Dubai, to all of the ports on the Iranian coast, later to Kuwait, to Bahrain, and virtually every inhabited island in the Gulf, including Kish Island before it became an international resort. We spent several nights in the home of the Sheikh of Kish. I still remember that very, very vividly and very fondly. For a young man, of course, this was the greatest possible adventure. I returned to the United States, completed my degree, and was fortunate to get admission to graduate school, where I was supported by an NDEA Title VI fellowship that required me to continue my study of Persian and Arabic, so I was now locked in. I traveled to Iran and Afghanistan in 1969, riding from Herat into the Afghan hills with Michael Berry, your own Princeton professor, who accompanied me on this adventure. We were transformed. I was Bahram Khan, he was Eskandar Khan. And we had an absolutely marvelous adventure, and it was my first introduction to Afghanistan with great success, I thought. And so I later then began my field work on Persian sociolinguistics in 1971 and 1972. At this time, Iran was virtually unknown to Western scholars, except for Brian Spooner, of course. There were very few anthropologists who had ever worked in Iran, and I found myself in a generation of scholars my own age discovering Iran for the first time. Although Iran was, pardon me, in many ways a modern nation, even then, it was still almost untouched from an anthropological perspective. Of course, we cultural anthropologists and linguists were preceded by many groups, by missionaries, travelers, by the post-World War II Point 4 program and the Peace Corps. There were also a few historical Iran specialists whose now classic works, inspired us. Edward Brown had spent his year amongst the Persians. Gertrude Bell came and had a tragic love affair and learned to translate Persian poetry. One nearly accidental ethnographic piece, Grass, by the film director Marion Cooper, who went on to make King Kong, documented the summer migration of the Bakhtiari tribe in a now classic film from 1920. Anne Lampton accomplished astonishing linguistic work with her masterful with her masterful social science monograph, Landlord and Peasant in Persia. Arthur Pope and Phyllis Ackerman documented the Persian arts. Henri Massé published his Croyances et Coutumes Persans, the great compendium of Persian folklore in the Western language. Historian Peter Avery explored modern Iran, and architecture expert and espionage agent Donald Wilbur wrote about cultural life in Iran, past and present, as well as his Persian gardens and garden pavilions. And the great Richard Fry was the dean, was the dean of Iranian philological studies in the West, and a great friend. Researchers from a wide variety of nations pioneered anthropological, folkloric, and linguistic research. Jan Ripka, Anatol Krymsky, V.S. Rostogureva, Morio Ono, Enrico Cerulli, Jean-Pierre Degas, Pierre Lecoq, just to name a few. But admirable as these great works were, interest in Iran largely focused on the great treasures of Persian archaeology, art, architecture, and literature. Attempts to really understand Iranian culture and society in depth had to wait for a new generation of anthropologists, along with a few sociologists, geographers, and historians. During this period, starting in the 1960s, scholars from the West had so much to discover. It was a virtual feast of opportunity for field work, with the formidable task of simply recording the details of life and culture. Iranian social scientists were also beginning to develop their discipline and discover their own nation. The first Persian language textbook in sociology, Jam-e Shanasi ya Ilm al-Ijtima, was published in 1944 by the philosopher Dr. Yahya Mahdavi and revised several times. The Institute for Social Studies and Research at the University of Tehran, founded in 1958 by Dr. Ehsan Naraghi, served as a training ground for many young Iranian social scientists. Pioneers such as the great analyst of tribal life and economics, Nader Afshar Naderi, or the folklorist Abul Qasim Anjabi Shirazi, the great literary scholar and folklorist Ghulam Hussein Saadi, who wrote literature under his nom de plume, Gohar Morad, Majid Rezvani's Le Théâtre et la Danse en Iran, and the great Bahram Beyzai, who is living, thank goodness, with his Namayish Dar Iran, still untranslated to our great shame. And Reza Arastey's early attempt, Man and Society in Iran, fostered introspection about 25 centuries of Iranian civilization. So Iranian scholars began to conduct their own research on tribal and village life, oftentimes as part of degree programs for Iranian or Western universities. Much social science research was undertaken under the aegis of the Plan Organization. And as we already mentioned, at the University of, at Pahlavi University, now at the University of Shiraz, under the Department of National Development. Iranian social scientists conducted research on urban, rural, and tribal societies with an aim of fostering development and modernization. Social commentator, of course, Jalal al-Ahmad, his Gharb Zadegi became a modern classic as a critique of Iran's cultural contact with Western society, while Simin Daneshvar incorporated many traditional folkloric and cultural themes in her literature. The Shiraz Festival of Arts director, filmmaker Farokh Ghaffari, was also a researcher into the traditional arts in Iran. Research by Western scholars in Iran was facilitated, as has already been mentioned by a couple of people this morning, by a number of research centers that began to be established in the 1960s and 1970s. The British Institute of Persian Studies was established in 1961. The American Institute of Iranian Studies was founded in 1967 as the effort of a consortium of universities, and it continues today as the only organization in the United States dedicated to the funding of research in Iranian studies. Similar institutes were founded by French and Italians. Both BIPS, the British Institute, and the American Institute maintained residences in Tehran, where many young scholars resided when they first arrived in Iran. Although these institutes' missions encompassed all research disciplines, they provided an important launching pad for young researchers beginning their fieldwork in ethnography. The period from 1967 to the time of the Iranian Revolution saw a tremendous increase in anthropological research activity by both non-Iranians and Iranians. Iranian universities began to offer anthropology courses, and some Iranian students began their professional careers in these classes. So I want to turn to the time of the revolution and afterwards. Anthropology is frequently condemned these days for carrying out its work in an atmosphere that's facilitated by colonialism or neo-colonialism. In the 1970s, we were just beginning as a profession to be self-reflexive. Paul Rabinow's reflections on fieldwork in Morocco and Jean Briggs' Never in Anger were somewhat shocking to anthropologists. Clifford Geertz, Rabinow's graduate advisor, told him in no uncertain terms not to publish reflections on fieldwork, saying that he would ruin his career by doing so. But Rabinow and history proved Geertz wrong. However, anthropologists working in Iran were sanguine about their somewhat privileged position in Iran. As a result, they had a great deal to answer for later in life. In many ways, fieldwork by Westerners in Iran was facilitated by the special relationship that the United States and other Western nations had with the Shah's regime. I supported my fieldwork in part by being employed by Iranian institutions. I taught at Pahlavi University, now Shiraz University, doing my initial doctoral fieldwork since although I had a Winter-Gren Fellowship, it was not nearly enough to sustain me for even 1 year. After I finished my PhD and was appointed as an assistant professor at Brown University, I still longed to return to Iran. I felt very fortunate to have received a special fellowship provided by Iran for a scholar in honor of the American bicentennial. I don't think that's going to happen again. Hardly realizing what that might imply about my ties to the special political relationship of the day. The fellowship lasted about a semester, but I wanted to stay on and continue my research on traditional performance. I felt I had another stroke of luck, and I was employed by National Iranian Radio Television, where I worked with colleagues, notably the theater director, still my very good friend and researcher, Mohammad Bagher Ghaffari, who's not related to Farrokh Ghaffari. Maybe they're related, but very distantly. Researching Ta'zieh and the Ruhozi traditional theater traditions and other traditional performance forms. I then was involved with and was employed by the Iranian government to help start a new university, Reza Shah Kabir University, later the University of Mazandaran. And with this, I was joined by Mary Catherine Bateson, Margaret Mead's daughter, who was going to be the chancellor of this organization. And we have always thought that we were going to be in trouble for having done this, but Mary Catherine, Dr. Bateson was just invited back to Iran to celebrate the anniversary of the founding of the university as the apical founder. So I think that maybe some things have been forgiven. So although I and other anthropologists of my generation were acutely aware of the human rights violations of the Pahlavi regime, we rarely, if ever, got involved in the social protests that were to be seen from time to time in public places. We heard stories of family members being arrested, but we had trouble on deciding how we should be affected by this. There's no question that our work was facilitated by the relationship between the United States and Iran and with other Western nations and Iran. But I personally was young, I was absolutely besotted with Iran, and I merely thought myself lucky. I loved every minute I spent with my Iranian friends. I found every aspect of life to be fascinating, and I never thought that my work might at some level be detrimental to my Iranian friends. And truly, I believe that working with Iranian institutions was beneficial to Iran itself, and not entirely self-delusion, I must say. Aside from my delight in living in Iran, I felt that I was doing good ethnographic work. My dissertation dealt with communication dynamics in Iran. Sometimes people characterize it as my study of ta'aruf. The book was later translated into Persian, and I'm told that it has become a textbook in Iran today, to my great surprise. I don't get any money from it, but I'm glad that people are reading it. My research on Iranian traditional theater also yielded a great deal of research material that I continue to work with even today. I also conducted extensive research on rural and tribal life, social organization that helped contextualize my understanding of much of Iranian urban life as well. My joy at this work was so great that I wrote my parents and told them that I intended to give up my job at Brown and to move to Iran permanently. In fact, I sent in my resignation, and shortly afterwards, fate had other things in store. When the revolution of 1978-1979 arrived, I and others were somewhat sanguine at first. We had seen protests before which had always abated, but this time matters were different. We listened to the protests. We saw our friends and colleagues turn from quiescent, passive supporters of the Pahlavi regime to active protesters calling for the downfall of the Shah. During this time, I was traveling throughout the country, and so it was sobering to see the protests grow and spread to small towns and even to villages such as Aliabad. I stayed through the revolution, leaving the country in March of 1979. There was no longer a role for me in Iranian society, as all non-Iranians, except for a few who had married into Iranian families, had left the country. My job was canceled in Iran, and to my surprise, some of my colleagues refused to speak to me. My departure in 1979 was uneventful. I went to the Air France office, purchased a ticket with Iranian rials, and departed for Paris and then to the United States. It while a lot of American citizens were being herded by American troops into the airport and terrorized, sleeping in the airport overnight with armed guards. Despite my resignation, Brown University very generously gave me back my position. And I was humbled both by the revolutionary events and by my own naivete about my relationship to Iran and Iranians, and my own overly optimistic view of my accomplishments. I was reminded of this poignantly by veteran anthropologists George and Mary Foster, who had worked for decades in Chiapas in Mexico. I encountered George, who had just returned from his umpteenth fieldwork period there, and I asked him what he had learned after all these years. He said, "Mary and I agreed this year that we were just on the verge of really understanding the people we were working with." Indeed, it's a lifelong process. For almost a decade, it was impossible for me to return to Iran, and in this I was not alone. The easy access that American researchers had in Iran dissolved after the establishment of the Islamic Republic. I went on to work in India, in Japan, and I found the work there equally fruitful and enjoyable. And I told myself that after all, anthropology is a comparative discipline, and it was probably time for me to move into other field situations and use my insights that I had developed on Persian and Iranian society to develop an understanding of greater generalities about the nature of humanity. In Japan and India, I found wonderful parallels to the hierarchical dimensions and contrasts in intimacy and use of language in Iran. I also discovered the nature of both sacred and secular performance traditions and ways that they fit into the fabric of culture. Found wonderful comparative dimensions for the structure of rural and even tribal communities in places so far from Iran. And this brings me to the broader question of what we have been doing as anthropologists working in Iran and what we might aim to do in the future. These are themes that have already been touched on this morning, and so I hope you won't mind my repeating some of the same truths that I think our colleagues have already told us. All of us who do ethnography anywhere in the world have several dimensions to our work as anthropologists. First, we are documenters of cultures and societies that we study. Ethnography has become such a loosely applied term throughout the world of research that it has lost much of its core meaning. Almost anyone from outside of anthropology who spends a little time talking to people can advertise themselves as doing ethnography, however insubstantial. It has become fashionable in many quarters: medicine, political science, public policy, and business, to name a few. Undoubtedly, many in these non-anthropological fields do take ethnography seriously, but for many others, ethnographic research is, shall we say, less than rigorous. Ethnography as developed from the time of Boaz is painstaking and exacting collection of data. Holographic, as Erica had said this morning, and so very eloquently. Coupled with an equally painstaking interpretation of that data. We sometimes have critique from some of our other colleagues that anthropology is just anecdotes. No, real ethnographic research is data-oriented. It is full of immense amounts of data that we collect. And the data that we collect may be quantitative, it may be qualitative, or both. But in order to yield real knowledge, it has to bear a distinct relationship to the research questions that we're being asked. It must be sufficient to answer those research questions, and it must be of sufficient quality and depth to support the conclusions drawn by the ethnographer. Ideally, it should be inductive or deductive-inductive rather than purely deductive. We can learn a lot from our ancestors. As much as we may question pre-World War II ethnographic methods, it is difficult to deny the rigor with which these methods were employed by the very best anthropologists in our field. Margaret Mead, to take an example, had volumes and volumes of material to support her research. Conclusions that she thought, to support her research conclusions. And she sought to collect data of every possible sort available to her. interview data, statistical data, photographic images, film, literature, folklore collection, and on and on and on. Indeed, Mead never trusted just one of the many data sources she used. And why? Because she felt that none of her conclusions were ever proven until she could demonstrate that they were verified in a parallel data source, maybe more than one. Folk tales were reflected in visual evidence, kinship data resonated in language, gendered behavior was reflected in religion and economics. Mead worked as a scientist, formulating hypotheses about the characteristics of the societies she studied, and then endeavored to prove those hypotheses with solid evidence gathered from multiple sources. This is where casual ethnography often fails. We see people today claiming to use ethnography who believe that casual observation and collection of isolated anecdotes constitutes real research. It does not. Ethnography requires solid, concentrated work over a long period of time with continual testing and retesting of the kinds of hypotheses that Mead embraced as new data is collected. Eventually, patterns emerge that have predictive value for behavior, thought, and attitudes. Naturally, this requires interpretation, but all science requires interpretation. Tell that to physicists and they get really, really mad. But it's nonetheless true of physics or chemistry or any of the laboratory sciences than it is in anthropology. You have to make value judgments. You have to make interpretations in order to be able to say anything about what you're investigating. The genius of ethnography is that it reveals patterns of thought and behavior which members of the societies ethnographers study are themselves unaware. Franz Boas knew this very, very well, and that's why he, by the way, insisted that anthropologists study linguistics, because he said you can ask people about language and discover the patterns that govern their language, and these are patterns that they do not know themselves. And this was a very important, I think, understanding about human culture. I remember an occasion in one of my fieldwork situations where a fight broke out between two men of my acquaintance. I had done kinship analysis for the whole village, so I knew how everyone was related. I turned to a friend and I said casually, this must be serious for two cousins to be fighting. The man looked at me strangely and he thought a minute and he said, "You're right." He walked over to the fighting pair and he said, "Cousins shouldn't fight." The fight stopped immediately. Actually, they were maternal second cousins, okay? But the fight still stopped. And this is not an isolated experience for me. Frequently, the ethnographer knows more about the people than they know about themselves after we've collected enough data. No wonder we're oftentimes accused of being spies, as I have many times been accused. Okay? A seasoned ethnographer eventually does develop such a strong sensitivity to the cultural environment in which he or she works that new information, as it occurs, is able to be immediately incorporated into a seasoned existing framework of knowledge. Because the ground is known as a result of extensive work in a culture, new events can be readily interpreted in the light of past events. The crucial factor is having long enough experience to be able to see the broad, regular patterns that govern life in a particular culture, and the experience to be able to see how those patterns fit with general patterns of human behavior. Now I want to talk about what we have learned as ethnographers about Iran, and why this is important not just for Iranian studies, but for anthropology itself. Sometimes we tend to beat up on ourselves a little bit and say that our work has not been significant. I beg to differ. I think our work has been very significant and will continue to be in the future. So, and it's here in my narrative that I begin to slight my excellent colleagues, many of whom are in this room, whom I've learned so much from by not mentioning their work specifically, but I think you'll recognize who I'm talking about in your own work and in those of others. I want to focus rather on the plethora of things that we've all learned through ethnographic investigations in Iran, many of which we did not know 50 years ago, things that have allowed us to continue understanding Iran today. Even as many of us in Europe and North America have been unable to continue our extensive our intensive ethnographic fieldwork in post-revolutionary days, this work sustains our understanding going forward. And as I look back to the immediate post-World War II era, it is easy to see how our knowledge has deepened since then. One of the first and most extensive bodies of knowledge that has emerged over the years that Brian Spooner talked about this morning is the understanding of tribal culture and social organization. We have studies of the Qashqai, the Basri, the Bakhtiyari, the Boyer Ahmad, the Arab tribe of Fars, Mamasani, Luri, Shah Savan, Turkmen, Kurds, and Baluchis, as well as many local subdivisions of these broad tribal groups. Iran's many tribal societies were revealed by anthropologists to not be somehow primitive people living under primitive conditions, but rather highly organized, potentially comfortable people living in balance with their environment through a complex of social and economic organization. Tribes were shown to be in symbiotic relationship with the settled agriculturalists and urban dwellers. Their kinship and marriage patterns were shown to be miraculous vehicles of economic resource management, varying according to the climatic conditions of any given year. We developed deep respect for tribal people even as the government of Iran seemed to distrust them, feeling both uneasy at the lack of governmental central control and the feeling that the mere existence of tribes was a sign of backwardness for Iranian society. It wasn't the place of the ethnographer, of course, to tell the central authorities that they were wrong, even though we oftentimes thought so. The tribal peoples were one of the great assets of the nation, actually, but ethnographic literature showed this case to be the case over and over again. We grew to appreciate the nobility, the personal strength, the strong sense of social cohesion, and the ties that tribal people had to their environment. As modern Iranian society wanted little to do with the tribal people, anthropologists were able to document their life and their robust social and cultural organization. As tribal life has changed, having a base of understanding about the patterns of 50 years ago has helped us to understand the course of change in the life of the tribal people. Having studied Iranian tribes, ethnographic research has allowed Iranian specialists to formulate comparative studies with the tribal peoples of other parts of the world. The Arab world, East and West Africa, the Asian steppes, and in fact, even the New World. The economic details may be different in each place, but social organization is comparable throughout the world. Going on, understanding the basic patterns of rural life and agriculture in Iran is another area of tremendous ethnographic progress and understanding. We came to understand the basic patterns of the traditional division of land resources into land, human labor, animal labor, seed, and water, and how these factors shaped human life. We talk about this as the Bonnet system. The division of these economic resources between landlord and sharecroppers was one fundamental principle. Of all these factors, the division and allocation of water was one of the major sources of social organization. But just as with tribal society, patterns of kinship allowed for the strategic allocation of economic resources, affecting access and reallocation of all of those factors. Ethnographers have shown that rural agriculturalists, like all rural people in Iran, have had a challenging life in managing their economic and political affairs. But we now know that life in settled agricultural communities is rich, complex, and integrated with other sectors of society. In particular, the integration of rural settled communities with tribal groups and with urban centers reveals a highly networked culture which has grown even richer and more substantial with the advance of technology. And Brian mentioned Paul English's early work pointing this out, which I think is still very important for us. Urban life. As a result of decades of research, we now see urban life in Iran as extraordinarily complex and growing more so. The life of urban dwellers is inextricably tied to rural areas still, though those ties are changing rapidly. In the past, the dynamic of landlord and peasant was basic to the social organization of cities and villages. However, After the land reform of the 1970s, that urban-rural tie shifted. It was no longer the landlord who anchored the relationship, but rather former rural residents themselves moving to cities but maintaining rural ties. Urban life has taken on a new character of its own as industrialization has taken hold throughout the country. Education has grown and modernization has progressed. Centers of learning and training and employment are now ubiquitous throughout the nation. The largest cities, Tehran, Mashhad, Tabriz, Isfahan, and Shiraz, are still growing, but smaller cities and towns have modernized and increased their urban amenities. Reliable water, electricity, fuel, shopping are found virtually everywhere, and 50 years ago that was not really the case. But the presence of universities and other higher learning institutions have had an enormous effect in convincing young people to pursue their education locally. These changes are increasingly being documented through solid ethnography. Now, along with urban life come complexities of a less salutary sort. Social problems such as alcoholism and drug addiction, control of crime, black market operations, smuggling, and corruption are all endemic to complex urban settings. These have always been present in Iran to one degree or another, but they've been modernized in many ways while still maintaining their place within the traditional societal structure. And now, new legal structures and political realities since the revolution have also presented the need for social adjustment on the part of Iranian citizens in both the pre- and post-revolutionary generations. Studying these adjustments not only tells us something about the changing civic landscape in Iran, but also about the traditional coping structures of Iranian life that allow flexibility in the conduct of personal, family, and group life in the face of difficult social and political conditions. It has always been known that Iran is a traditionally multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious society. The strong integration of minority populations in Iran is unique in the Middle East today. Ethnography began to document the meaning of the relationship between core ethnic identity and identification with wider Iranian citizenship and culture starting in the 1970s. Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Sunni Muslims, and Baha'i are among the religious minorities that have all been studied. Azerbaijanis, Gilakis, Mazandaranis, Talishis, Roma, and Arabs, as well as the numerous tribal groups already mentioned, have likewise been researched to determine the basis and structure of their complex multiple identities as part of the Iranian whole. There's still much work to be done in this area, but we started it some time ago, and I hope that it continues. With regard to gender, one of the most fertile areas for research in post-World War II period has been research on gender and sexuality in Iran. Many researchers have explored the social and economic roles of both women and men. The rise in female participation in society has been remarkable since the revolution of 1978-79. With greater literacy and greater opportunities in public life, research on women and their unique and expanding cultural roles has been considerable. Similarly, advances in our understanding of sex and gender roles in Iran has been the subject of much ethnographic work. It's not surprising that Iranian gender construction is unique, as gender construction in all societies is unique. It's a truism. But the complex contrast between gender roles in pre- and post-revolutionary society has created a fascinating social landscape that many ethnographers have been able to document with great skill. The perpetual parochial concern with the nature of the hijab somewhat masks the richness of this research. We are also beginning to see studies of non-traditional gender roles, as Afsaneh pointed out early this afternoon, and identities emerging in the ethnographic literature to add to the richness we see in the complexity of Iranian society. With regard to religion, the Iranian Revolution in 1978-79 resulted in increased social attention to religion and religious institutions. But ethnographers had already been active in documenting the richness of Iranian religious life. studies of religious attitudes in rural and urban areas revealed decisively that Iran was no monolithic society regarding religion. The wealth and variety of religious expression throughout Iranian society continues to fascinate ethnographic observers. Standard theology in religious schools and among male and female religious students revealed the details of training and practice in Shi'a observance. The many studies of expressive forms of religion, such as Taziyeh, Mauludi, Rozekhani, and many others. We have Hosseiniers, but we also have Fatimiers. So it's really a wonderful landscape of popular expression of religions. Muharram processions and ceremonies, shrine pilgrimage and visitation, and Sufi ceremonies have all been under continuous study to solve the very potent question of the relationship between spirituality, orthodoxy, and orthopraxy in Iranian life, all of whom are separable and form a complex kind of formula. Identity. Just as the question of the construction of identity has seen an extensive rise in anthropological literature outside of Iran, it's not surprising to have seen ethnographers of Iran turn to the fascinating problem of how individuals see themselves and manifest their identities through expressive culture, poetry, music, writing, dress, narrative, and the aforementioned social media. Youth and women whose identities are being shaped and reshaped under changing social conditions today have garnered special attention in this area of research, and their work is comparable to the identity research that's being done in many other parts of the world. Technological advances in Iranian society have constituted one of the hallmarks of post-revolutionary the Iranian generation. Iran has more internet connections in absolute terms than any other country in the Middle East. In per capita terms, it is the second largest number of internet connections of any Middle Eastern nations except Israel, which is small. Persian is one of the most widely used languages on the internet. It's thus no wonder that studies of Iranian cyberculture have been widely pursued. The use of blogs, text messaging as a form of self-expression, electronic communication as a social or political communication medium, and technology use as a hallmark of Iranian life have been growing for over a decade, actually 2 decades. The fascination of these studies provide a showing of the integration of these technological advances with traditional life. And this marks the ethnographic description of the Iranian technological world as a unique and growing research enterprise. Now, I'd like to turn to the significance of Iranian ethnography, which I mentioned to you before. I've described this kind of laundry list of the advances in knowledge that has been provided by ethnographic work in Iran to make a specific point. Without this path-breaking work in all of these areas, ethnographic researchers would not have been in the position to document some of the most important dynamic developments in Iranian life today. First and foremost is the revolution of 1978-1979. Just as I and others were caught by surprise at the demise of the Pahlavi regime, so we spent some years afterwards trying to account for its dynamics, because we obviously missed something. However, because of our solid ethnographic research that had already been laid down by ourselves and our colleagues, we did have some excellent tools to help us. We knew by the time of the revolution quite a bit about Iranian religious life, its structure, and its symbolism. The centrality of the early figures of Shi'a Islam were paramount in constructing the so-called Karbala paradigm of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein that framed the symbolic structure of the revolution. Starting from this, we could explore the dynamics of the religious and political leadership in its various manifestations, from secular to Marxist to religionist, and understand how the revolution played out in all of its complexity. Aside from overt Shia symbolism, we also knew a great deal about Iranian spirituality and feelings of inner tension that many felt under the pre-revolutionary regime and social conditions. a tension that was released in the fervor of the revolution. We also had a firm foundation in understanding the economic and social tensions of Iranian rural life based on intimate knowledge that we had of the history of rural land tenure from the landlord era through the land reform to the trauma of abandonment of rural land holdings. We also knew of the tribal dynamics dealing with the restrictions placed on tribal movement and economy during the Pahlavi era, information that the Iranian government itself did not have or chose to ignore. We also had documented the move from rural agricultural work to urban factory work and the pressures that were put on the urban landscape in the form of restricted urban settlement and rising real estate pressures. Added to this, we were aware of the rising expectations of the Iranian middle class and the economic and social pressures that they were under. These areas of information were merely building blocks in constructing cohesive theories of the genesis of the revolution, but they were all important. And though many inside and outside Iran also shared these insights and wrote about them, the fine-grained details were documented through ethnography. Ethnographic research had laid down a baseline for Iranian societal and cultural institutions that has allowed researchers to gauge change over time. Changes in political culture, gender roles, identity expression, urban advances, intergenerational dynamics, rural and tribal social life, and even expressive cultures such as music, performance, poetry, and literature showed the transition in Iranian cultural life from pre-revolution to revolution to post-revolution. Now we're in the post-revolutionary period because we have a rising generation that has no knowledge of the revolution at all, even though they retain many cultural, let's say, artifacts from earlier ages. But as the French say, plus que ça change, plus que c'est la même chose. More things change, the more they remain the same. Iran changes, but it also remains the same. Understanding these changes is also helping us to understand what remains constant in the purview of the ethnographer. A great deal of new research has focused on the Iranian diaspora throughout the planet. Though it is relatively new, previous economic knowledge about the status quo ante has aided in establishing the core elements that have persisted in the lives of Iranians now living outside of Iran. Though these travelers have lived outside of Iran for many years, they retain their essential Iranianness in ways that are not so often seen in other diasporic cultures. Our knowledge of Iranian cultural dynamics has also helped in educating the general non-Iranian public about Iranian life, culture, and social attitudes as international tensions surrounding Iranian activities have increased. Some of this information is decidedly low level. Iranian women can drive, for example. I can't tell you how many times I've had to say that. but other matters have been more difficult, such as explaining Iranian religiosity or Iranian leadership roles or phrases like Marg bar Amrika and what it could possibly mean in a cultural context, rather than being taken in translation in the United States. Nevertheless, our expertise has been effective in blunting many of the more ignorant communications issued by politicians and ideological detractors. Would there were more of us. Finally, we now have a strong body of ethnographic research on Iran, and it is now possible for researchers to show the relevance of this specific research to broad anthropological problems that draw on research from other world areas. And indeed, Iranian ethnographers are making their mark on theory and method outside of the Iranian and Middle Eastern spheres. Gender construction, social change, identity construction, intergenerational dynamics, religious expression, environmental studies, economic development, and many other fields have already benefited greatly from Iranian ethnographic research, and we hope there'll be more. In the early 1970s, some of us early researchers were concerned that Iranian ethnographic research was so specific that it was slow in contributing to overall anthropological knowledge, as has been mentioned by several of you already today. Now I can say with confidence that, at least in my opinion, that fear has been allayed. As a body, we are now making our mark and contributing to the highest goals of our profession, to create new knowledge about our particular society of focus, Iran, and at the same time to add to our store of knowledge about humanity and its characteristics. Now, as a final note, for those of us who worked for years in Iran, we are called upon to comment on contemporary Iranian issues. We are frequently confronted with leading questions born of prejudicial attitudes. When we answer with factual information, we may be accused of supporting the mullahs or supporting terrorism. Just as before the revolution, we were often accused of supporting the Shah. Answering these questioners who have biased attitudes based on misinformation is very difficult. But I believe we must engage with them just as we engage with the broad general public. We must be honest, we must hold to facts, and we have a great deal of facts to provide. The most common problem that all anthropologists face in dealing with the public, and this is not just in Iran, it's everywhere, is that people frequently confuse explanation with advocacy. We should always be ready to explain and to be clear about the limits of our advocacy, which is a separate kind of statement. And I believe that it is our professional and ethical duty to do this, and our privilege as ethnographers to use our knowledge to promote understanding and to combat prejudice. We should never, never refrain from this duty. Thank you very much.